The elevator lurched to a grinding halt between the 23rd and 24th floors of Morrison Tower, and Michael Chen felt his world shift in ways that had nothing to do with the broken machinery. The fluorescent lights flickered once, twice, then settled into an uneasy hum that seemed to echo the rapid beating of his heart. Beside him, pressed against the polished steel wall, stood Emma Rodriguez, CEO of TechVantage Solutions, her perfectly tailored blazer a stark contrast to his worn custodial uniform. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Her manicured fingers gripped her phone with the kind of desperation Michael recognized from his own late-night moments of panic, when Sophie's fever spiked, or the rent notice arrived early. But Emma wasn't calling about sick children or overdue bills. She was trying to reach someone, anyone, who could restore the control she'd spent 15 years building around herself like armor. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant sounds of the city far below and the mechanical groans of a building that seemed to be holding its breath. Michael had cleaned Emma's office countless times over the past 3 months, had emptied her trash bins filled with protein bar wrappers and empty coffee cups, had watched her through glass conference room walls as she commanded meetings with the kind of authority he'd once possessed as a project manager before layoffs and custody battles had rewritten his story. She'd never looked at him directly, never acknowledged his presence with more than a distracted nod, treating him like part of the building's infrastructure. Invisible. Necessary but unremarkable. Now, trapped in a metal box suspended high above Portland's downtown core, invisibility was no longer an option. The emergency button yielded nothing but static when pressed. Cell service had vanished somewhere between floors, leaving them stranded in a technological dead zone that felt impossible in a building dedicated to digital innovation. Emma's composure began to crack first, her breathing becoming shallow and rapid as the reality of their situation settled around them like dust. Michael had seen panic before, had learned to recognize it in Sophie's eyes during thunderstorms, in his own reflection during those dark months after the divorce, when everything solid had seemed to dissolve beneath his feet. The difference was that Emma's panic came wrapped in designer clothes and professional vocabulary, but fear was fear regardless of its packaging. She slumped against the elevator wall, her phone clattering to the floor as her hands began to shake. The sounds she made were barely human, raw and desperate in a way that suggested this breakdown had been building for much longer than the 20 minutes they'd been trapped together. Michael had learned long ago that crisis revealed character in ways that ordinary circumstances never could. In the pediatric ward where Sophie had spent 2 weeks fighting pneumonia the previous winter, he'd watched parents transform from polished professionals into fierce protectors who slept in plastic chairs and negotiated with insurance companies like their lives depended on it. Emma's transformation was happening faster, her carefully constructed executive persona dissolving like sugar in rain. She began talking, words tumbling out in a stream that seemed to surprise her as much as it surprised him. She spoke about quarterly projections and board meetings, about hostile takeovers and market share, but underneath the corporate jargon was something Michael recognized from his own darkest moments. The suffocating weight of a life that looked successful from the outside, but felt hollow from within. Her confession came in fragments, scattered admissions that painted a picture of someone who'd climbed every mountain she'd been told to climb, only to discover the view from the top was nothing but more mountains stretching endlessly toward a horizon that never seemed to get closer. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. She talked about sleeping 4 hours a night, about meals eaten standing up between conference calls, about a penthouse apartment that felt more like an expensive hotel room than a home. The words kept coming, as if the broken elevator had also broken whatever internal mechanism kept her professional mask in place. Michael found himself leaning forward, drawn into her story not by curiosity, but by recognition. The details were different, but the underlying ache was familiar territory. Michael's own story unfolded slowly, like photographs developing in a dark room he'd once used during his college years, when he'd believed art and passion could sustain a person through anything life might throw at them. Those dreams felt like artifacts from someone else's life now, buried beneath layers of responsibility and survival that had accumulated like sediment over the years since Sophie was born. He told Emma about the advertising agency where he'd once been the golden boy, the creative director who could turn any client's vision into campaigns that won industry awards, and generated millions in revenue. The corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Willamette River. The team of designers who looked to him for inspiration. The six-figure salary that had made him feel invincible until the day it all disappeared. The recession had hit their industry like a tsunami, washing away agencies that had seemed permanent fixtures in Portland's creative landscape. Michael's company had been acquired by a larger firm in New York, and the new owners had decided the Portland office was redundant. 60 employees became numbers on a spreadsheet, their careers reduced to line items in a cost-cutting initiative that probably earned some executive a bonus for improving operational efficiency. Michael had been 32 years old with a mortgage, a pregnant wife, and the kind of confidence that comes from never having experienced real failure. The severance package had seemed generous at the time, enough to support them while he searched for another position at his level. But the creative industry had contracted like a muscle in spasm, and positions that matched his experience and salary requirements had become as rare as snow in July. Months of interviews led to rejection letters that praised his portfolio, while explaining they'd chosen candidates with more recent experience or different skill sets. The savings account dwindled steadily, eaten away by mortgage payments and medical bills, as Jessica's pregnancy progressed from complicated to high risk. Sophie had been born 2 months premature, spending her first weeks in an incubator that cost more per day than Michael had once spent on lunch meetings with clients. The medical bills arrived like a paper avalanche, each envelope containing numbers that seemed designed to crush whatever optimism remained. Jessica had tried to be supportive, but the stress of a sick baby and mounting financial pressure had exposed cracks in their relationship that success had previously hidden. She'd married a creative director with a bright future, not an unemployed man who spent his days applying for jobs he was overqualified for but couldn't afford to refuse. The arguments had started small, whispered disagreements about money and priorities that gradually escalated into full-scale battles fought in hospital corridors, while their daughter struggled to breathe on her own. Jessica had never said she blamed Michael for their situation, but her silence during those long nights spoke louder than any accusation could have. The divorce had been inevitable, processed through the legal system with the same cold efficiency that had eliminated his job. Jessica had wanted to move back to California to be closer to her family, and Michael hadn't been in a position to fight for custody when he couldn't even afford his own apartment. Sophie would spend weekends with him once he got back on his feet, the judge had decided, as if getting back on one's feet was simply a matter of determination rather than opportunity. Michael had signed papers that gave him every other weekend and alternating holidays with his daughter, a custody arrangement that felt like being allowed to visit his own heart on a schedule determined by strangers. The custodial job at Morrison Tower had been a lifeline thrown to a drowning man, steady work with benefits that covered Sophie's ongoing medical needs. The pay was a fraction of what he'd earned in advertising, but it was reliable in a way his previous career had never been. He'd swallowed his pride along with his morning coffee and learned to find dignity in work that others viewed as invisible. The night shift suited his schedule, allowing him to be available when Sophie stayed over, and the quiet hours in empty offices gave him time to think without the constant noise of failure that had echoed in his head during those first desperate months. Emma listened to his story with the kind of attention he hadn't received from another adult in longer than he could remember. Most people, when they discovered he'd once been successful, treated his current situation like a cautionary tale or an inspiration porn narrative about finding happiness in simple things. But Emma's questions were different, focused not on how he'd fallen, but on how he'd survived the falling. She wanted to know how he'd learned to measure success in Sophie's laugh instead of client approval, how he'd found purpose in providing stability rather than creative innovation, how he'd rebuilt his identity around being present rather than being impressive. The elevator's emergency lighting cast strange shadows on the walls, creating an intimate atmosphere that felt separate from the world beyond the steel doors. Michael found himself describing Sophie in detail, her determination to master multiplication tables despite her learning disabilities, her collection of stuffed animals that each had elaborate backstories she'd created, her way of asking questions that revealed how much more she understood about life than most adults gave her credit for. He talked about weekend mornings when she made pancakes that were always slightly burned but tasted perfect because she'd made them herself, about homework sessions at the kitchen table, where her focused concentration reminded him why patience was a more valuable skill than creativity. Emma's own childhood emerged in fragments, a privileged upbringing in Seattle where success had been the family religion and achievement the only acceptable form of worship. Her parents had been venture capitalists who measured love in terms of quarterly returns and viewed their daughter's accomplishments as reflections of their own strategic parenting decisions. Private schools had been investments in her future networking potential. Extracurricular activities had been chosen to build a competitive resume rather than develop genuine interests. And college had been preparation for the kind of career that would generate enough wealth to ensure the cycle continued with the next generation. She'd never experienced the kind of financial uncertainty that had shaped Michael's recent years, but her story carried its own weight of expectations and obligations that had compressed her life into a series of strategic moves rather than conscious choices. Every decision from her college major to her current position had been calculated to maximize professional advancement, and the result was a life that looked impressive in business magazines but felt empty when experienced from the inside. She'd never learned to measure success in terms of personal satisfaction or meaningful relationships, because those metrics weren't quantifiable in the way her parents and later her business school professors had taught her to think about achievement. The maintenance crew finally freed them after 4 hours that had felt simultaneously like minutes in eternity. The elevator doors sliding open to reveal a crowd of concerned building security personnel and emergency responders who treated their rescue like a routine technical problem rather than the life-altering conversation it had become. Emma stepped out first, her CEO persona snapping back into place with practiced efficiency as she thanked the rescue team and assured everyone she was perfectly fine. But something in her eyes had changed, a flicker of uncertainty that hadn't been there before, as if the woman who'd entered the elevator that morning was slightly different from the one who emerged. Michael gathered his cleaning supplies with the same methodical precision he brought to all his tasks, but his movements felt different now, more deliberate. The conversation with Emma had awakened something in him that had been dormant for years, a sense of his own worth that extended beyond his ability to provide for Sophie or maintain the sterile perfection of corporate offices. As he watched Emma disappear into the crowd of concerned executives who'd gathered to ensure their CEO was unharmed, he wondered if their 4 hours of brutal honesty would dissolve like a dream once they returned to their separate worlds of boardrooms and supply closets. The next morning brought an unexpected email to Michael's personal account. A simple message from Emma asking if he'd be willing to meet for coffee before his shift began. She'd found his contact information in the building's employee directory, she explained, and hoped he wouldn't find her request inappropriate given their different positions in the company hierarchy. The formality of her language couldn't quite hide the vulnerability underneath, the same raw honesty that had emerged in the elevator when professional facades had proven insufficient to mask human need. They met at a small cafe in the Pearl District, far enough from Morrison Tower to avoid curious colleagues, but close enough that Michael could walk there after dropping Sophie at school. Emma arrived first, looking oddly out of place in the casual environment despite her attempts to dress down in jeans and a sweater that probably cost more than Michael earned in a week. She'd chosen a corner table away from the morning rush of laptop-wielding freelancers and coffee-fueled business meetings, creating a pocket of privacy in the bustling space. The conversation began tentatively, both of them navigating the strange territory of a relationship that didn't fit conventional categories. They weren't colleagues in any meaningful sense, despite working in the same building. They weren't friends yet, having shared only 4 hours of crisis-induced intimacy. They were something new. Two people who'd accidentally seen each other clearly and were trying to figure out what to do with that clarity. Emma spoke about her sleepless night, how returning to her penthouse apartment had felt like stepping into a museum exhibit titled Successful Executive, circa 2024. Everything in her living space had been chosen by an interior designer who specialized in creating environments that photographed well for business magazines. The furniture was beautiful and uncomfortable, the art was expensive but soulless, and the kitchen was equipped with professional-grade appliances she'd never learned to use. She'd stood in her living room at 3 in the morning, still wearing the clothes she'd worn in the elevator, and realized she couldn't remember making a single decision about how she wanted to live, rather than how she was supposed to live. Michael shared his own midnight revelations, how he'd sat in Sophie's room after putting her to bed and wondered what kind of example he was setting for his daughter, not about work ethic or responsibility, values he'd successfully modeled despite their circumstances, but about courage and authenticity. Sophie was watching him navigate the world, learning from his choices about what it meant to be an adult, and he'd realized that his careful strategy of staying invisible and avoiding risk was teaching her to do the same. Their coffee grew cold as they talked, the morning rush subsiding around them, while they remained locked in conversation that felt both urgent and timeless. Emma described the moment in the elevator when she'd realized she couldn't name a single activity that brought her genuine joy outside of work achievements. Michael talked about his fear that he'd become so focused on survival that he'd forgotten how to dream about anything beyond making it through another month. The idea emerged gradually, neither of them quite sure who suggested it first. Emma had always been interested in sustainable technology and social impact investing, interests she'd suppressed because they weren't aligned with her company's focus on profit maximization. Michael had maintained his creative skills over the years, designing flyers for Sophie's school events and creating digital presentations for parent-teacher conferences, small projects that reminded him he still had talents beyond janitorial expertise. What if they could combine Emma's business acumen and financial resources with Michael's creative abilities to build something meaningful? Not another app designed to monetize human attention or a platform optimized for data harvesting, but a company that actually solved problems people cared about. Emma had enough money saved to fund a startup for at least 2 years, and Michael had enough desperation to take risks that his former successful self might have avoided. The conversation stretched through the morning and into lunch, two people discovering they'd been hungry for the same thing without knowing it. Emma suggested they spend time together outside the artificial environment of Morrison Tower, to see if their connection could survive in the real world, where power dynamics and professional obligations didn't create artificial barriers or forced intimacy. Michael invited her to Sophie's soccer game that weekend, an invitation that felt simultaneously casual and momentous. Emma had never attended a children's sporting event in any capacity, had no frame of reference for the social dynamics of suburban parenthood, or the particular joy of watching 8-year-olds pursue victory with passionate intensity and no regard for conventional strategy. Sophie's team, the Purple Dragons, was having a challenging season that could be diplomatically described as character building. They'd won 2 games out of 12, but their enthusiasm remained undiminished by their record. Sophie played midfield with the same determined focus she brought to math homework, running toward the ball with conviction, even when her teammates were running in the opposite direction. Her ponytail bounced with each step, and her face showed the kind of concentration usually reserved for brain surgery or defusing bombs. Emma found herself genuinely invested in the game's outcome within minutes of arriving, cheering for players she'd never met, and learning the names of Sophie's teammates with the same attention to detail she typically reserved for quarterly reports. She discovered that watching children play sports was simultaneously relaxing and nerve-wracking, a meditation on effort and outcome that bore no resemblance to the strategic competitions that dominated her professional world. Michael pointed out the subtle dynamics of the team, explaining which kids were natural leaders and which ones were still learning to balance individual achievement with collective success. Sophie, he noted with obvious pride, had become the team's unofficial encourager, the player who helped others up when they fell and celebrated her teammates' successes as enthusiastically as her own. She'd learned resilience from their family's struggles, he realized, developing emotional intelligence that would serve her far better than any trust fund or professional network. After the game, which the Purple Dragons lost 7-3 but celebrated as if they'd won the World Cup, Emma joined Michael and Sophie for ice cream at a local shop that specialized in unusual flavors and generous portions. Sophie ordered something called Birthday Cake Explosion that contained enough sugar to power a small city, while Emma chose vanilla with what she claimed was adventurous restraint. Michael opted for coffee flavor, explaining that parenthood had made caffeine a food group rather than a beverage choice. Sophie's questions for Emma were direct in the way that only children could manage without causing offense. Why did she wear such fancy clothes to work? Did being a boss mean she could fire anyone she wanted? Had she ever been poor? Did she know how to ride a bicycle? The interrogation continued through dessert, with Sophie displaying the same thorough approach to information gathering that she brought to her collection of animal facts and her analysis of cartoon character motivations. Emma answered honestly, admitting she'd never learned to ride a bike because her parents had considered it an unnecessary risk that might result in injuries that could affect her academic performance. She explained that being a boss meant making difficult decisions about people's jobs, but also meant being responsible for ensuring everyone had work that paid them enough to take care of their families. Sophie listened with the serious attention she gave to nature documentaries, occasionally asking follow-up questions that revealed she understood more about economic inequality and social responsibility than most adults Emma knew. The afternoon stretched into evening as they moved from the ice cream shop to a nearby park where Sophie demonstrated her mastery of the monkey bars and challenged Emma to try the equipment designed for children half her size. Emma's first attempt at crossing the monkey bars resulted in immediate failure and genuine laughter, the kind of unself-conscious amusement she hadn't experienced since childhood. Sophie offered coaching tips with the patience of someone who understood that learning required practice, and that adults were often slower learners than children. Michael watched Emma's transformation throughout the day, noting how her posture relaxed and her voice changed when she wasn't performing the role of successful executive. With Sophie, she became curious rather than commanding, asking questions because she wanted to learn, rather than because she needed to control information flow. She seemed genuinely delighted by Sophie's stories about school and friends, laughing at jokes that weren't particularly sophisticated, but were delivered with infectious enthusiasm. As the sun set over Portland's skyline, visible through the gaps between park trees, Emma found herself reluctant to return to her empty apartment and the stack of reports that awaited her attention. The day had felt like a glimpse into an alternative life, one where success was measured in moments of connection rather than quarterly earnings, where achievement meant learning something new rather than optimizing something existing. Sophie had accepted Emma's presence in their routine with the adaptability that children possessed, when adults didn't make things complicated with their own anxieties and expectations. She'd treated Emma like a potential friend rather than a powerful stranger, extending the same generous inclusion she offered to new classmates and neighbors. Her easy acceptance had created space for Emma to be herself rather than the carefully constructed professional persona she'd maintained for so many years. Michael realized he was falling in love, not just with Emma but with the version of himself that emerged when he was around her. Someone who could dream about the future rather than just survive the present, who could imagine taking risks because the potential rewards included more than financial security. Emma saw him as someone with unrealized potential rather than someone who'd fallen from former heights, and her perspective was shifting his own understanding of what his life could become. The evening ended with Emma helping Sophie with a school project about community helpers, an assignment that required identifying people whose work made their neighborhood function better. Sophie had chosen to write about her father, describing how he kept buildings clean and safe so people could work and learn without worrying about their environment. Her description of Michael's work emphasized its importance rather than its humble status, presenting custodial services as essential infrastructure rather than invisible labor. Emma contributed ideas about presentation and organization, helping Sophie create a poster that showcased her father's contributions with the same care typically reserved for CEOs and doctors. Together, they transformed a simple school assignment into a celebration of work that was meaningful precisely because it was performed without expectation of recognition or glamour. The project became a metaphor for their growing relationship, finding value in connections that didn't fit conventional categories but created something beautiful when nurtured with attention and respect. The crisis arrived on a Tuesday morning in late November, delivered through a conference call that would later be remembered as the moment everything changed. Emma sat in her glass-walled office listening to the board of directors explain that TechVantage Solutions was being acquired by a Silicon Valley conglomerate, known for aggressive cost-cutting measures and operational consolidation. The news shouldn't have surprised her, given the industry trends and their recent financial performance, but the timeline was brutal. The acquisition would close in 6 weeks, and the new owners had already identified redundancies that would eliminate 40% of the Portland workforce. Michael learned about the acquisition the same way everyone else did, through an all-staff email that used corporate language to deliver devastating news. The custodial services contract would be terminated as part of the transition, replaced by a national cleaning company that could provide services at a lower cost. His last day would be December 15th, exactly 3 weeks before Christmas, and 2 weeks before Sophie's winter break ended. The timing felt deliberately cruel, as if the universe had been waiting for him to feel secure before pulling the foundation out from under his feet again. Emma's first instinct was to fight the decision, to use her position and influence to protect the employees who'd become more than just names on organizational charts. She scheduled emergency meetings with the board, preparing presentations that demonstrated the value of maintaining local operations and the hidden costs of rapid workforce reductions. But her arguments fell on ears that were more interested in immediate cost savings than long-term sustainability, and she quickly discovered that her role as CEO had been largely ceremonial since the acquisition talks began. The board's response to her advocacy was swift and decisive. If she couldn't support the strategic direction of the transition, perhaps she wasn't the right leader to guide the company through its next phase of growth. The suggestion wasn't subtle, and Emma understood that she could either participate in dismantling everything she'd built, or step aside and let someone else handle the destruction. Neither option felt acceptable, but fighting would only delay the inevitable, while making the process more painful for everyone involved. Michael found himself caught between anger and resignation, emotions that had become familiar companions during his previous career collapse. The difference this time was that he had Emma, someone who understood the human cost of business decisions and cared about the collateral damage that executive strategies inevitably created. But their relationship also complicated his response to the situation, creating conflicts between his desire to support her and his need to protect himself and Sophie from another financial catastrophe. Emma's attempts to find alternative employment for the affected workers revealed the harsh reality of Portland's job market in their industry. Most companies were experiencing similar pressures to reduce costs and increase efficiency, making them reluctant to hire workers whose previous employer had deemed them redundant. The few positions available offered significantly lower wages and reduced benefits, forcing people to choose between unemployment and underemployment in an economy that seemed designed to squeeze everyone except those at the very top. The stress of the situation began affecting Emma's health in ways that no amount of executive coaching or stress management seminars had prepared her to handle. She developed insomnia that made decision-making increasingly difficult, and her appetite disappeared completely, replaced by a constant nausea that she attributed to the ethical compromises her position required. The irony wasn't lost on her that achieving everything she'd thought she wanted had led to a situation where she felt powerless to protect the things that actually mattered. Michael watched Emma struggle with the weight of responsibilities that extended far beyond her individual circumstances, and he recognized the same trapped feeling that had consumed him during his divorce proceedings. She was caught between competing loyalties and impossible choices, trying to minimize harm while operating within systems that prioritized profit over people. Her genuine anguish over the situation made him love her more, while simultaneously making him wonder if their relationship could survive the pressure of their different positions in the company hierarchy. The tension reached a breaking point during a conversation in Emma's office after hours, when the building was empty except for security personnel and the cleaning crew that would soon be replaced by cheaper alternatives. Michael had come to discuss his transition timeline, but the conversation quickly became about their relationship and whether it could exist outside the context of their shared outrage at corporate callousness and mutual recognition of each other's struggles. Emma confessed that she'd been considering resigning from TechVantage, walking away from the salary and benefits that had defined her adult life in order to preserve her integrity and sanity. But resignation felt like abandonment of the employees who were depending on her to advocate for them, even if her advocacy had proven largely ineffective. She was paralyzed by the fear that leaving would make things worse for everyone, while staying required her to participate in decisions that violated her fundamental values about how people should be treated. Michael's response surprised both of them. Instead of offering reassurance or solutions, he challenged Emma to stop thinking like a CEO and start thinking like a person who had choices beyond the limited options being presented by boards of directors and acquisition specialists. The conversation that followed was their first real fight, a heated exchange about privilege and responsibility, about the difference between taking risks when you had safety nets and taking risks when failure meant your child went without necessities. Emma accused Michael of not understanding the complexity of her position, the way executive responsibilities created obligations that extended beyond personal preferences. Michael countered that she was using those responsibilities as excuses to avoid making difficult decisions, hiding behind corporate hierarchies instead of taking action based on her own values. The argument escalated until they were both saying things designed to hurt rather than illuminate, words chosen for their accuracy rather than their kindness. The fight ended with Michael leaving Emma's office without resolution, both of them angry and hurt in ways that felt disproportionate to their disagreement. The underlying issue wasn't really about Emma's job or Michael's unemployment, but about whether their relationship was strong enough to survive the real-world pressures that had destroyed both of their previous attempts at building stable lives. They'd found each other during a crisis, but crises eventually end, And the question was whether what they'd built together could exist in ordinary time, with ordinary problems. Emma spent the following week avoiding Michael, eating lunch at her desk instead of meeting him at their usual cafe, leaving the building through different exits to prevent accidental encounters in hallways or elevators. The avoidance felt juvenile but necessary, a way to protect herself from the disappointment of discovering that their connection had been situational rather than substantial. She threw herself into the acquisition transition with renewed focus, telling herself that professionalism was more important than personal relationships when people's livelihoods were at stake. Michael interpreted Emma's withdrawal as confirmation that their different social positions made a real relationship impossible. She was a CEO dealing with multi-million-dollar decisions, while he was a janitor worried about making rent, and the gap between those realities was too wide to bridge with good intentions and shared conversations. He began making practical preparations for unemployment, updating his resume and researching job opportunities while trying to explain to Sophie why they might need to move again without frightening her about their financial security. The distance between them grew wider each day, fed by misunderstandings and hurt feelings that neither of them knew how to address without risking further damage to their already fragile connection. Emma threw herself into work with desperate intensity, as if she could solve everyone's problems through sheer determination and strategic thinking. Michael focused on practical concerns, preparing for the worst-case scenario, while hoping for outcomes he didn't dare expect. Both of them were protecting themselves from additional pain, but their self-protection was creating the very abandonment they were trying to avoid. The resolution came through Sophie, as most important revelations do, delivered with the straightforward wisdom that children possess before adults teach them to complicate simple truths. She appeared at Emma's office door on a Friday evening, having convinced building security that she was delivering something important to the lady who helped with her school project. Emma looked up from her computer screen to find an 8-year-old holding a handmade card decorated with glitter and determined expression. Sophie's message was brief and devastating in its clarity. Her dad was sad because he missed talking to Emma, and Emma looked sad too whenever Sophie saw her in the elevator. Adults, Sophie had observed, seemed to make everything more complicated than it needed to be. If two people liked each other and made each other happy, why were they choosing to be miserable instead? The question hung in the air like a challenge, impossible to dismiss or rationalize away. Emma's resignation letter was submitted that evening, effective immediately rather than after the standard 2-week notice period. She'd realized that staying meant becoming complicit in a system that treated people as expendable resources, and leaving meant accepting responsibility for her own choices rather than hiding behind corporate obligations. The financial implications were terrifying, but the moral clarity was liberating in ways she hadn't anticipated. Michael found Emma waiting by his truck in the parking garage Monday morning, holding 2 cups of coffee and wearing jeans instead of her usual business attire. The conversation that followed was different from their previous interactions, focused on possibilities rather than problems, on what they could build together instead of what circumstances were destroying around them. Emma's savings could fund their startup for 18 months. Michael's creative skills could differentiate their products in crowded markets, and their combined experience could help them avoid the mistakes that killed most new businesses. The company they launched 6 months later specialized in sustainable technology solutions for small businesses, combining Emma's understanding of market needs with Michael's ability to create user-friendly designs that solved real problems without requiring significant technical expertise. Their first product was inventory management software, designed specifically for local retailers, developed after months of conversations with shop owners who'd been ignored by larger technology companies. Sophie became their unofficial quality assurance specialist, testing interfaces with the brutal honesty that only children could provide. If an 8-year-old couldn't figure out how to use their software, Emma and Michael reasoned, small business owners probably couldn't either. Her feedback shaped every product they developed, ensuring their solutions remained accessible rather than impressive. 2 years later, their company employed 12 people, including several former TechVantage employees who'd found new careers in sustainable technology development. Emma had never felt more successful, measuring achievement in terms of problems solved and lives improved rather than profit margins and market dominance. Michael had rediscovered his creative passion while building financial security for Sophie's future, proving that survival and fulfillment weren't mutually exclusive goals. The elevator that had changed everything was retired during Morrison Tower's renovation, replaced by newer models with better safety systems and faster response times. But Emma and Michael still took the stairs whenever possible, preferring the gradual ascent that gave them time to talk about their day, their dreams, and the family they'd chosen to build together. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.